The wind carried dust across the wide stretch of prairie as Samuel Carter stood at the edge of his ranch, boots planted firm in the dry earth, hat tugged low against the morning sun. He had written the letter 3 months ago, short, plain words scrawled by calloused hands, not meant to charm, only to tell the truth. He was a man alone, with cattle to tend and silence for company, and he needed a wife. Not for romance, not for poetry, but for the steadiness of another soul under his roof. When the stagecoach rattled into view, his pulse quickened in a way that surprised him. Dust spiraled behind the wagon, wheels creaking, horses snorting, the whole thing a song of arrival. He tightened his jaw, steadying himself. This was it, the woman who had read his simple letter, who had agreed to leave everything she knew and travel west for a stranger's promise. The door swung open, and one by one the passengers stepped down. Then came her. She had to turn sideways to pass through the frame, and when she set foot on the ground, the earth itself seemed to acknowledge her weight and presence. She was taller than Samuel by a full head, broad-shouldered, her shadow swallowing his whole frame. Her skirt swayed as she landed, boots sinking slightly in the dust, and she looked at him with clear, steady eyes that didn't waver. Samuel swallowed hard. This wasn't the fragile, bonneted girl he had imagined when he first wrote his letter. This was a woman built like the land itself, unyielding, immense, rooted. The rancher's hand twitched at his side, half in awe, half in doubt. But when she smiled, just a small curve of her lips, quiet and sure, something in him settled. He tipped his hat, words sticking in his throat. Finally, he managed, "Ma'am. Welcome to Carter Ranch." And she, with a voice low and rich as a church hymn, answered, "I came for hard work, Mr. Carter. I reckon I won't disappoint you." Samuel Carter stood stiff in the dust, his hat-brimmed shading eyes that had seen more than their share of empty days. He hadn't expected her to look like this. In the quiet of his evenings, when he'd read her letters by lantern light, he had built a picture in his mind, a modest woman, slight maybe, with delicate hands that would fumble at first with ranch chores but eventually learn the rhythm. What he saw now was no delicate creature. The woman before him towered above him, broad enough across the shoulders to make a working man think twice before raising his voice. Her gaze was steady, though, and that mattered. She didn't look away, didn't fidget, didn't give that nervous glance most women spared when they first met him, scarred face, weather-creased brow, and the permanent frown that hard work had carved there. She looked at him as though she was measuring a man the way she might measure a mule or a horse, taking stock, weighing worth. "Reckon you got a wagon?" she asked after a moment, her voice low but clear. Samuel blinked, realizing he'd been staring too long. "Yes, ma'am," he said, voice gruff. "This way." He hefted her trunk. Lord, it weighed near as much as a calf, and tried not to show the strain. She followed, long strides keeping up with ease, her boots thudding on the ground. He wondered, not for the first time, what kind of woman left her world behind for a stranger's letter. The wagon ride back to the ranch was quiet but not uncomfortable. She sat straight beside him, hands folded in her lap, looking out at the open land as though she was already claiming it. He stole glances when he dared, her jaw strong, hair braided tight, the sun turning the loose strands copper. She was older than he'd guessed, maybe in her 30s, with a steadiness that made him feel both smaller and strangely safer. "Name's Samuel," he said finally, the silence too heavy. "I know," she answered without turning. "And you know mine." He nodded. Her name had rolled around his tongue many times in the quiet, Margaret Ann Fletcher. But saying it aloud now felt different, too intimate, as if it might tether them faster than either was ready for. The ranch came into sight after a while, a modest house of rough-cut boards, a corral, a barn that leaned slightly east from last winter's storms. The cattle dotted the hills beyond, horns catching the sun. Samuel braced himself, waiting for disappointment to flicker across her face. Many women had dreamed of finer things, even in these hard lands. But Margaret only nodded once, as if she'd already seen it in her mind and approved. "You work it alone?" she asked. He cleared his throat. "Yes, hired hands come and go, but mostly it's me." She studied the barn, the corral, the sagging fence. Then she rolled up her sleeves, thick forearms bare to the elbow, and said simply, "I'll need an axe. That fence won't hold come winter." For the first time in months, maybe years, Samuel laughed. It startled him, rough and rusty, but it was laughter all the same. They settled into a rhythm faster than Samuel thought possible. Margaret rose with the dawn, her heavy steps shaking the small house as she stoked the fire and started breakfast. She worked without complaint, hauling water, mending fence posts, cooking hearty meals that filled his belly and made him realize how little he'd been eating before she came. She handled tools with a confidence that made his chest ache. Where had this woman come from, this force of nature wrapped in gingham skirts? At night, they shared quiet suppers at the small wooden table. The first week, words were few, just the scrape of spoons and the creak of chairs. But then small things slipped in, a story from her childhood, a question about his cattle, a dry remark that made his mouth twitch in a smile. She had a wit as sharp as barbed wire, but she never used it to cut deep. Still, Samuel wrestled with unease. He hadn't been prepared for her size, her presence. Folks in town already whispered, he was sure of it. The lonely Carter had sent off for a wife and got a giantess instead. He imagined the smirks, the laughter. Pride twisted in him, hard and bitter. But then he'd watch Margaret swing an axe, muscles straining as wood split clean, or see her kneel gentle as a lamb to patch a calf's leg, and the pride turned into something else entirely, something he didn't have words for. The night it shifted between them came quiet, unplanned. A storm had rolled across the plains, wind howling through cracks in the house, rain pelting the windows. Samuel had sat by the fire, boots off, trying to mend a bridle strap. Margaret came in from the barn, soaked through, hair plastered to her face, but smiling. She'd gone out to settle the cattle, he realized, without him even asking. "Stubborn beasts," she said, shaking off water, "but they'll stay put now." She sat heavily in the chair across from him, stretching out her long legs toward the fire. Steam rose from her skirt. Samuel tried not to stare, but the sight of her, strong, capable, unbothered by the storm, did something to him. The silence stretched. Finally, he cleared his throat. "You didn't have to go out there." Her eyes met his, calm as always. "I did. This is my ranch too now." Something in his chest cracked open at those words. "My ranch too." He looked down at his rough hands, then back at her, and in that moment he felt smaller than he ever had, but not in a way that shamed him. Smaller, because she was so large in spirit, in body, in everything. And maybe that was what he had needed all along. The storm passed by morning, leaving the world rinsed clean. The air smelled of wet sage and turned earth. Margaret was already outside when Samuel pulled on his boots and stepped off the porch. She was wringing rainwater out of blankets she'd spread on the corral rails, her braid heavy and damp down her back. "You didn't sleep?" he asked. She shrugged. "Storm rattled the boards in the loft. Figured I'd see to it instead of listening all night." Samuel wanted to argue, wanted to tell her she didn't need to carry every weight, didn't need to do more than her share. But the truth was plain, she could, and she did, and she didn't seem to begrudge it. He closed his mouth and simply joined her. They worked side by side that morning, patching the fence, hauling feed. When she lifted a sack of grain onto her shoulder as though it weighed no more than a loaf of bread, Samuel caught himself staring again. He was used to women who looked like they'd break on the prairie winds, not one who looked as though she belonged to it. By noon, the sun blazed overhead. Margaret pulled off her bonnet and wiped sweat from her brow, streaking dust across her skin. Samuel offered her his canteen, and she drank deeply before handing it back. Her lips touched the rim, and when he raised it to his own mouth a moment later, something small and strange stirred in him. He told himself not to notice, not to think on it, but the thought stayed. The weeks passed, and their rhythm settled deeper. Margaret planted a garden behind the house, turning the soil with steady determination. Samuel caught himself watching her more often than he admitted, the strong curve of her back as she leaned on the hoe, the way she hummed low tunes that carried on the breeze. She wasn't delicate in any sense, but she was steady, and steady was what a man like him needed. Not everything was smooth. There were moments when their tempers clashed, sparks flying sharp in the small house. Samuel was set in his ways, his boots always left by the door, tools in their proper place. Margaret had her own notions, and she wasn't shy about speaking them. "You can't patch a roof with hope and a prayer," she told him one evening after supper, arms crossed, when he suggested waiting till spring. "It'll leak all winter if you don't mend it proper now. It's held before," he grumbled. "And I reckon that's why the boards are soft and near rotted through." Her voice wasn't cruel, but it was firm. He bit back the retort on his tongue and studied her instead. She didn't argue to nag. She argued because she meant to build something lasting. That realization softened him more than he let on, and the next morning he found himself on the roof with hammer and nails, Margaret steadying the ladder below. The first time they went to town together, heads turned. Samuel felt the stares crawl over his skin, the sideways looks, the whispers. Margaret walked tall beside him, her stride unbroken, chin lifted as if she hadn't noticed a thing. But Samuel noticed. He felt the heat of shame rise in him, not for her but for himself, for caring what other folks thought. At the mercantile, she chose flour, sugar, beans. She lifted a barrel of salt pork into the wagon without waiting for help, and the storekeeper's eyes nearly popped out of his head. Samuel cleared his throat, placed coins on the counter, and tipped his hat low. The ride home was silent until Margaret finally spoke. "They look at me like I'm some kind of spectacle." Samuel's hands tightened on the reins. "They don't know you." She gave a dry laugh. "Neither do you, Samuel Carter." The words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. He realized then how little he'd asked her about herself, how little he knew beyond what her letters had told. That evening, he asked. She told him she'd been raised on a farm in Illinois, one of 7 children, and always the largest. Her father had treated her like another son, setting her to chores the others couldn't manage. Suitors had been scarce, men wanted pretty little wives who'd make them feel taller, stronger. Margaret had no patience for that. When her parents passed and the farm was sold, she'd faced a choice: go into service, or strike out on her own. His letter had come at the right time. "I figured a man who asked plain and simple was better than one who promised poetry," she said, voice low. "I didn't need flattery. I needed a place to belong." Samuel listened, and for the first time since her arrival, he felt the thread of her story weave into his own. The seasons turned. Autumn brought cooler winds, leaves skittering across the yard. Margaret canned vegetables from her garden, lined jars neat on the shelf. She smoked meat with Samuel, their hands working in tandem, the silence between them companionable now. One evening, as the first frost silvered the grass, Samuel found himself lingering by the fire after supper. Margaret sat in her chair across from him, darning socks, the lamplight catching in her hair. The moment felt fragile, suspended. He cleared his throat. "You've done more for this place than I could have hoped," he said, words rough. Her eyes lifted to his. "I came here to build, Samuel." "Same as you." The warmth in her gaze startled him more than her sighs ever had. He felt the urge then, to reach across the space, to take her hand. But he didn't. Not yet. Winter tested them. Snow piled against the barn doors, the wind howled through the cracks in the house. They took turns keeping watch on the cattle, breaking ice on the troughs. Margaret swung the axe to split firewood, breath steaming in the frigid air, while Samuel hauled it inside. Nights were long, the small house drafty, but together they endured. One bitter night, when the wind shrieked like a living thing, Samuel woke to find the fire dying low. He rose, shivering, and went to stoke it, but Margaret was already there, wrapped in a quilt, feeding logs to the flames. She glanced back at him, hair loose around her face. "Couldn't sleep," she murmured. He sat beside her on the floor, the heat of the fire warming them both. Silence stretched, heavy and close. Then, before he could think better of it, he reached for her hand. It was broad, calloused, strong, but when her fingers curled around his, he felt something gentle there too. They didn't speak of it in the morning, but the air between them shifted. The bond that had grown in work and silence deepened into something unspoken, steady as the beat of a heart. By spring, when the prairie grass turned green again, Samuel knew he couldn't imagine the ranch without her. Not as a helper, not as a partner in chores, but as the center of it all, the center of him.